The rain was a cold, gray sheet, blurring the world into a smear of wet asphalt and dark, skeletal trees. It had been falling for as long as I could remember, which wasn't long at all. Memory was a locked room with no key. There was only the thin, soaked fabric of a gray dress clinging to my skin, the mud sucking at my bare feet, and a hollow ache in my chest that felt older than I was. I didn't know my name. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew how to put one foot in front of the other. Headlights cut through the gloom, growing from distant stars into twin suns that forced me to shield my eyes. A vehicle, long and black and impossibly clean for this muddy country road, slowed to a stop beside me. It moved with a predatory silence, its engine a low thrum that vibrated through the soles of my feet. I kept walking, my focus narrowed to the broken white line on the road. Acknowledging the car felt like acknowledging a wolf that had just noticed you. The back door opened with a quiet, expensive click. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a man stepped out into the downpour. The rain seemed to hesitate before touching the shoulders of his suit, a charcoal wool so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. He didn't use an umbrella. He simply stood there, a figure of impossible stillness in the storm. I could see the sharp crease of his trousers, the glint of a platinum watch on his wrist, the severe line of his jaw. He was out of place, an element of a different, more dangerous world dropped into this rural emptiness. I finally stopped, my body tensing. He took a step closer, his polished black shoes sinking slightly into the soft shoulder of the road. His eyes, when they met mine, were the color of black coffee, and they held an unnerving lack of emotion. They scanned me from head to toe, lingering on my bare feet, my drenched dress, my face. I expected pity, or disgust. I saw something else entirely, a flicker of something ancient and unreadable, like a geologist finding a fossil in a place it should not exist. "You'll die out here," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, carrying easily over the sound of the rain. It wasn't a question or an offer of help. It was a statement of fact. I said nothing. My throat was tight, words of foreign country I hadn't visited. "Get in the car." Again, not a request. It was a command, delivered with the casual authority of a man who had never been disobeyed. I hesitated, a primal instinct screaming at me to run. But where? Into the dark woods? Down a road that led to nowhere? The cold was seeping into my bones, a deep, shuddering chill that promised a slow, quiet end. The car was warm. It was shelter. It was also a trap. He must have seen the conflict in my face. He took another step, closing the distance between us. I could smell his cologne now, a subtle, clean scent of cedar and something like burnt sugar. It was a scent of wealth and power. "I'm not going to ask again," he said, his voice dropping, becoming softer, which was somehow more menacing. I made a choice, the only one I had. I walked past him, my bare feet leaving muddy prints on the pristine floor mat of the SUV. The door closed behind me, shutting out the storm and sealing me inside a world of soft leather and conditioned air. The silence was absolute. He got in the opposite side, settling into his seat without a sound. The car pulled away from the curb as smoothly as it had arrived. I stared out the window, watching the rain-lashed countryside slide by. I was intensely aware of him, of the space he occupied. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his attention like a physical weight. "What is your name?" he asked the window. "I don't know," I whispered. The words felt rough and used. He was silent for a long time. I risked a glance at him. He was looking at me now, his head tilted slightly. That strange, unreadable expression was back in his eyes. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something that bordered on disbelief. "Then I will give you one," he said finally. "For now, we will call you Yona." The name meant nothing to me, a collection of sounds. But the way he said it, it was different. He spoke the name like an old prayer, something sacred and broken that he was trying to piece back together. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a random act of kindness. This powerful, silent man hadn't just rescued a stranger from the rain. He had found something he thought he'd lost. and he had no intention of ever letting it go again. I was no longer a girl on the road. I was his. The only question was why. The countryside gave way to the sprawling, electric glow of Seoul. We drove through streets lined with glittering skyscrapers and rivers of headlights, a world away from the muddy road where he'd found me. The SUV turned into a private, tree-lined drive in what I would later learn was Gangnam, climbing toward a house that was less a home and more a modern fortress of glass, steel, and stark white concrete. It was carved into the hillside, overlooking the city lights like a predator from its perch. Armed guards in dark suits stood at the gate, bowing their heads as we passed. They didn't look like security. They looked like soldiers. My breath caught in my chest. This was not the home of a businessman. This was the seat of an empire. Inside, the house was cavernous and cold, filled with minimalist furniture and museum-quality art. The air was still and silent. A man in his 50s, with graying temples and a face etched with a lifetime of loyalty, met us at the door. He bowed deeply to the man beside me. "Sir," the older man said, his eyes flicking to me, wide with a carefully concealed shock. "Mr. Choi," my captor acknowledged. "Prepare the West Wing suite. Our guest will be staying with us."
Guest.
The word was a lie. I was a specimen, a curiosity. Maybe a ghost. "She will need a doctor," he continued, his gaze sweeping over me again. "And clothes. See to it." Mr. Choi nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, sir." I was led through silent, echoing hallways to a suite of rooms that was larger than any house I could imagine. A silent, efficient woman helped me out of my wet dress and into a warm robe. A doctor came, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, who checked my vitals, noted the scrapes on my feet and the mild hypothermia, but asked no personal questions.
She knew not to.
Later, food was brought on a tray. I ate mechanically, my mind racing. I was clean, warm, and fed, but I had never felt more trapped. After the tray was cleared, I found myself alone in the vast, silent room. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. It was made of thick, reinforced glass. Below, the lights of Seoul glittered like a fallen galaxy. I was a prisoner in a sky palace. I stayed in that suite for 3 days. The staff were polite but distant. They brought me food, clothes, books. They answered no questions. On the 4th day, I decided I was done waiting. I walked out of the suite and began to explore. No one stopped me. The guards in the hallways simply watched me pass, their faces like stone. The house was a labyrinth of cold beauty. I found a library with books in 3 languages, an indoor pool that reflected the gray sky, a gem with more equipment than a commercial facility. And I saw the men in dark suits, moving with quiet purpose, speaking in low tones. I heard snippets of conversations about shipments, territories, and betrayals. I didn't need a dictionary. I knew the language of power when I heard it. Kwon Ji-hoon, the man who had pulled me from the rain, was the absolute center of this universe. He was the boss. I found him in his study. The room was a command center, one wall a bank of monitors showing security feeds from all over the city. He sat behind a massive black desk, not working, but simply staring at a single, framed photograph. He didn't seem to notice me at first. I stood in the doorway, silent. "You've been exploring," he said, without looking up. I wanted to know where I was. "And do you?" "I'm in the home of a very powerful man," I said carefully. "A man who has soldiers, not bodyguards." He finally lifted his head. His eyes were heavy, shadowed with something I couldn't name. "They are one and the same." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. I walked in and sat down. The leather was cool against my skin. "Why am I here?" I asked, the question that had been screaming in my mind for days. "Why did you pick me up from that road?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the photograph on his desk and turned it to face me. It was an old photo, slightly faded, the colors muted. It showed a young woman, her hair styled in a way that was popular decades ago. She was smiling, her head tilted to the side. And she had my face. It was my face. Exactly. The same eyes, the same nose, the same curve of the lips. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain snaked down my spine. It was like looking at a version of myself from another time. Her name was Yona, he said, his voice quiet, rough. She was my fiancée. 20 years ago, she was taken from me. By my enemies. 20 years. But the woman in the photograph looked my age. No older than 20. The math didn't work. I don't understand, I whispered. Neither do I, he admitted, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his cold facade. A sliver of raw, aching vulnerability. She disappeared. We searched for months. Years. We never found her. No body, no ransom note. She just vanished. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, searching my face for something I couldn't give him. And then, 20 years to the day she was taken, I find you on a road not 10 miles from where she disappeared, wearing nothing but a dress, with her face and no memory of who you are. The pieces clicked into place, horrible and sharp. He didn't see me. He saw a ghost, a miracle, an impossibility he was determined to solve. I was a puzzle, a living relic of his greatest failure. You think I'm her? I said, my voice flat. I don't know what to think, he confessed. But you are here, and I will not lose you again. That was his wound, the woman he had failed to protect. And I was the living, breathing reminder of that failure. His obsession, his second chance. That night, a storm broke over the city, mirroring the one that had delivered me to him. The wind howled against the reinforced windows. I couldn't sleep. I found myself wandering the silent house again, drawn back to his study. The door was ajar. He was inside, standing before the wall of monitors, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was watching a feed from the front gate, where the wind was whipping the trees into a frenzy. He noticed me in the reflection on the screen. You should be sleeping. So should you. I walked further into the room. A file was open on his desk. I saw a name at the top. Kim Jung-woo. Who is that? I asked, nodding toward the file. He turned, his expression hardening. The man who took her. The leader of a rival family. The Kims. He explained it in clipped, detached sentences. The Kims and the Kwans had been at war for generations. Yona was supposed to be the key to peace, their marriage a union of the two empires. Instead, her abduction had ignited a bloody, 2-decade war. A war that was still simmering. As he spoke, I noticed a small gash on the back of his hand, red and angry against his pale skin. It was fresh. You're hurt, I said, before I could stop myself. He glanced at it dismissively. It's nothing. Let me see. I moved closer, my hand outstretched. He hesitated, then uncurled his fist, allowing me to see the cut. It was deeper than I thought, probably from a piece of broken glass or metal. Without thinking, I went to the small, private bathroom adjoining the study. I found a first aid kit under the sink. I returned with antiseptic and a bandage. He watched me, his face impassive, as I gently cleaned the wound. His skin was warm. The contact was electric, a small spark in the cold, sterile house. My fingers were steady as I worked. It was an instinct, a muscle memory from a life I couldn't recall. Competence under pressure. When I finished, my fingers lingered on his hand for a fraction of a second too long. I looked up and found him staring at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. The sound of the storm outside faded into a dull roar. It was just the two of us, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the dangers of his present. Thank you, he said, his voice a low murmur. It was the first time he had shown me even a hint of gratitude, a small, almost deniable tenderness. A few days later, the danger stopped being a story about the past. Ji-hoon had to attend a meeting in Itaewon. He insisted I come with him. You're safest where I can see you, he'd said. It wasn't a discussion. We rode in the back of an armored sedan, part of a 3-car convoy. Mr. Choi rode in the front passenger seat. The meeting was in a private room at an upscale restaurant. I waited in the car, watching the bustling street. After about an hour, they emerged. As Ji-hoon was about to get into the car, a black motorcycle screamed around the corner. The glint of steel was unmistakable. Everything happened in a blur. Mr. Choi shouted. Ji-hoon moved, not away from the threat, but toward me. He shoved me into the car, his body covering mine as the sound of gunshots exploded, shattering the window of a nearby shop. The car lurched forward, tires squealing. I could feel the hard planes of his chest pressed against my back, his arm protectively around my head. The scent of cedar and smoke filled my senses. The convoy sped through traffic, weaving through cars with terrifying precision. In the chaos, I saw our chance. The back door on my side hadn't latched properly. It swung open slightly as we took a sharp turn. Freedom. I could roll out, disappear into the crowded Seoul streets, and be gone. I could escape the ghost of Yona and the man who saw her in my face. But as I looked at Ji-hoon, who was now speaking in low, rapid commands into a phone, I saw the cold, lethal focus in his eyes. He wasn't panicked. He was in his element, and he had just used his own body to shield mine. I reached out and pulled the heavy door shut, the click of the latch sounding as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. I made a choice. I wasn't running. Not yet. We made it back to the house. The entire estate went into lockdown. Ji-hoon was furious, but it was a cold, controlled rage. He knew the attack was a message from the Kims. A message that they knew about me. Later that night, he found me in the garden, a small, manicured space of raked gravel and sculpted pines. The air was cool, the adrenaline from the attack still humming in my veins. "You had a chance to leave," he said, his voice quiet. He stood a few feet away, a dark silhouette against the city lights. The door was open. "Why didn't you run?" I looked at him, at the man who was a king in a violent world, a man haunted by a woman with my face. "I don't know," I said honestly. But it was a lie. I did know. Running meant being alone again, with no memory and no anchor. Here, in this dangerous, gilded cage, I had a name. I had a purpose, even if it was just to be a ghost. He took a step closer. The silence between us stretched, filled with unspoken things. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes. The proximity was suffocating, charged with a tension that had been building since that first moment on the rainy road. For the first time, I felt something other than fear or confusion when I looked at him. It was a dark, magnetic pull, a recognition. We were both haunted. We were both trapped. "Staying here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is more dangerous than any street in the city." "I know," I said. And I didn't look away. The attack changed everything. I was no longer just a houseguest, a living mystery. I was a target.
Yehone's vulnerability.
The Kims sent their next message 2 days later. It was a small package delivered to the front gate. Inside was a single item, a silver locket, tarnished with age. Ji-hoon's face went pale when he saw it. "It was hers," he said, his voice a raw nerve. "She was wearing it the day she was taken." It was a direct threat. They were telling him they still had a piece of his past, and they could take his future, me, just as easily. The pressure was making my own mind fracture. Flashes of images, sounds, and sensations started to break through the blank wall of my amnesia. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the feeling of falling, a woman's scream, the sharp, deafening crack of a gunshot.
They were disjointed, terrifying.
They felt real. I became obsessed with finding answers. I needed to know if I was truly this woman, Yona, somehow preserved in time, or just a cruel coincidence. One night, unable to sleep, I went to his study. He was gone, called to a late-night meeting. I sat at his desk, the glow of the monitors painting the room in an eerie light. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. It was a violation of his trust, a line I knew I shouldn't cross.
I did it anyway.
I searched for the police report from Yona's disappearance in 2002. It was heavily redacted, but I found what I was looking for in a witness statement. An ambush. A shootout. The witness reported seeing the woman, Yona, fall. She had been shot. The words blurred. She had been shot. They believed she was dead. So who was I? A doppelganger? A ghost made real? The thought should have made me run. It should have sent me screaming from that house, away from the man who was projecting his grief onto me. But it did the opposite. It solidified my resolve. I wasn't his ghost. I was something else. And I was in the middle of his war. The next day, Mr. Choi brought news. Kim Jong-woo had requested a meeting. A truce, he claimed. Ji-hoon knew it was a trap, but he had to go. To refuse would be a sign of weakness. He will try to ambush you, I said to Ji-hoon as he prepared to leave. You know he will. We will be prepared, he said, his voice grim as he checked the magazine of a sleek, black handgun. But I had a sickening feeling. I had spent hours poring over the maps and security feeds in his study, trying to understand his empire. The meeting place was too obvious. It was a classic pincer move. While watching the feeds, I saw it, a small detail. A cleaning crew, not on its scheduled route, entering a building that overlooked the main approach to the meeting point. It wasn't the meeting that was the trap. It was the journey there. They were going to hit the convoy. I had to warn him, but he was already gone, and the house was on high alert. I couldn't get a message out through official channels without revealing what I'd done. I had to be clever. I remembered a young maid, new and nervous, who had been kind to me. I found her in the kitchens. I told her I had a terrible migraine and needed a specific tea from a shop downtown, that Mr. Kwan insisted I have it. I lied, my voice filled with a fake urgency and distress that she bought completely. I gave her the cash, and a note folded into a tiny square. For the delivery driver, I said. A tip and directions. The note contained no names. Just a string of coordinates for the real ambush point and 3 words. Sniper. North Tower. I had her call a specific courier service I'd seen one of the guards use for personal deliveries, a service I knew was discreet. My heart pounded as she made the call. It was a morally gray act, manipulating a kind girl, using Ji-hoon's own resources against his enemies. I had crossed a line. I was no longer a bystander. I was a player in his lethal game. I waited for hours, pacing the room like a caged animal. Every sound made me jump. Finally, late into the night, I heard the convoy return. I ran to the entrance hall. Ji-hoon walked in, his suit torn at the shoulder, a bloody gash on his cheek. But he was alive. Mr. Choi was behind him, arm in a sling, but also alive. They had walked into the trap, but because of my warning, they had been the hunters, not the prey. Ji-hoon's eyes found mine across the marble floor. He knew. There was no other way they could have survived. He walked straight toward me, his expression unreadable. He dismissed his men with a flick of his head. We were alone. He stopped in front of me, so close I could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He looked down at me, and his cold control finally broke. You should have let them kill me, he said, his voice rough with a pain that had nothing to do with his injuries. Then you would be free. My breath hitched. He was offering me an out, offering to release me from his obsession, his war, his ghost. But the thought of leaving, of being back on that road, alone and empty, it was more terrifying than any of Kim's assassins. I don't want to be free, I confessed, the words torn from a place deep inside me. Not if it means being alone again. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous, more honest. It was an admission that his darkness felt like home because I had no other. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing the side of my face. His touch was a brand. In that moment, we were not a man and his ghost. We were 2 broken people, bound by a violent fate. The failed ambush pushed Kim Jong-woo over the edge. He had lost face, and a dozen of his best men. His rage was no longer tactical, it was personal. He knew my warning was the only thing that had saved Ji-hoon. So he changed his target. He no longer wanted to use me to hurt Ji-hoon. He just wanted me. The assault on the house came just after dawn. There was no subtlety. A truck crashed through the main gate, and a dozen armed men poured onto the grounds. Alarms blared, a sound that ripped through the quiet morning. Gunfire erupted. It was a siege. Ji-hoon was in my room in seconds. "We're going to the panic room," he said, his voice calm and lethal. He pushed me behind him, a gun already in his hand. We moved through the hallways, the sounds of fighting echoing around us. A stray bullet shattered a vase near my head, and he shielded me with his body, never breaking stride. We were almost to the reinforced door of the safe room when two of Kim's men appeared at the end of the hall, cutting us off. Ji-hoon pushed me into a small alcove. "Stay here," he commanded, and then he moved. It was like watching a deadly dance. His movements were economical, precise, and utterly final. It was over in seconds. But the delay was all they needed. As we reached the panic room, the door was blasted open from the other side. Kim's son, a younger, more arrogant version of his father, stood there, a gun aimed at us. His eyes widened when he saw me. "Yona," he breathed, his aim faltering for a split second. "It can't be." That hesitation was his mistake. Ji-hoon moved to intercept him, but another attacker came from the side, tackling him. I was left facing Kim's son, who was still staring at me, caught between shock and intent. He was raising his gun again. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. My survival instinct, honed by weeks in this violent world, took over. I grabbed a heavy, bronze sculpture from a nearby pedestal and threw it with all my strength. It hit him in the shoulder, making him stagger back with a cry of pain. His shot went wide, burying itself in the wall beside my head. I didn't wait. I lunged forward, grabbing a long shard of glass from a shattered picture frame on the floor. I was not a damsel. I would not be rescued. I would fight. My action bought Ji-hoon the time he needed. He dispatched his attacker and was on Kim's son in an instant. The fight was short and brutal. When it was over, Ji-hoon stood breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding. The immediate threat was gone. He turned to me. He wasn't looking at a ghost anymore. He was looking at me, Aaliyah, the woman who had just fought for her own life, for his. There was a new light in his eyes, a kind of awe and stark recognition. "You are not her," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. It was the most profound thing he could have said. He was releasing me from the burden of his past and seeing me for who I was in the present. The cost of that victory was high. Mr. Choi had taken a bullet to the leg protecting the West Wing. The house was a wreck. The war with the Kims was over, their leadership was broken, but the peace was paid for in blood. Weeks passed. A fragile quiet settled over the estate. The broken windows were replaced, the bullet holes patched. My flashes of memory never coalesced into a clear past, but they no longer terrified me. They were just scars from a life I'd survived, just like the ones Ji-hoon carried. One evening, I was standing at the window of my suite, watching the sunset paint the Seoul skyline in hues of orange and purple. I was no longer wearing borrowed clothes. I was wearing a dress I had chosen, in a deep blue that felt like my own. He came up behind me, his presence a familiar weight in the room. He didn't touch me. "It's over," he said. "You are free to go. I will give you anything you need, money, a passport, a new life anywhere in the world." He was offering me the escape I once thought I wanted. The open door. I turned to look at him, really look at him. I saw the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the faint scar on his cheek from the attack, the immense burden of the empire he commanded. He had pulled me from the rain, given me a name, and shown me a world of violence and loyalty. He had seen a ghost in my face, but I had forced him to see the woman standing in front of him. I thought of the cold, empty road, the endless rain, the hollow feeling of having no past and no future. Here, in this dangerous world, I had found a strange and savage purpose. I had found a place where my own fractured nature seemed to fit. I made my choice, not as a prisoner, not as a ghost, but as myself. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. A flicker of something powerful and undeniable passed through his dark eyes. It was not the soft comfort of love, not yet. It was something harder, more binding. A claim, an acceptance. He held out his hand, not to lead me, but for me to take. I placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that now existed between us. We were both survivors, bound not by a shared past, but by the violent present we had forged together. And in his dangerous world, that was the only vow that mattered.